week 3 of the fantasy baseball season. And here's a few hitters I would look to buy low and try to trade for this week here. The first guy is Francisco Lindor of the New York Mets. So Francisco Lindor signed a huge contract, obviously, right before the season started. After getting traded to the New York Mets in the offseason, he signed a 10-year, $340 million deal. And so far, he hasn't lived up to the contract or the hype, is Lindor. In the early going, he's 10 for 45 on the season with 1 home run, 3 RBIs, a 222 batting average, and a 357 on-base percentage. So Lindor, it's been a tough beginning for him so far this season. But yesterday was a good bright hope for him, getting his first homer under his belt and getting a 3-hit game as well. But so far, Lindor, he's only struck out 4 times in the first 45 at-bats, which is another good sign to me that he's putting the ball in play, but he's just not having good luck with it. So Lindor, we know he's a stud. We know he's one of the top shortstops, if not the top shortstop, in all of baseball and fantasy baseball. But it's just been a struggle for him. But maybe yesterday was a turnaround for him. And right now, while he's still batting in the 220s, this is the perfect time to go out there and buy him low while his value is at an all-time low. In the last few games for Lindor, April 17th at the Rockies, 1 for 6 with a run and an RBI in a doubleheader. April 18th at the Rockies, 0 for 4. April 20th at Chicago, 0 for 4. And last night, hopefully he's breaking out of things. 3 for 4 with a homer, an RBI, 2 runs scored. So Lindor, it's been a tough going for him, but I think last night could be the start of things. And right now, before he starts getting red hot as Lindor, this is the time to go trade him while his value's at an all-time low. The next hitter is Juan Soto of the Washington Nationals. So Juan Soto, he's on the 10-day injured list with a minor shoulder strain, is Soto. And so far, he's had a pretty decent season, is Soto. 15 for 50 from the plate, 2 home runs, 8 RBIs, a 300 batting average, and a 410 on base. So Soto, obviously, he was a top 5 fantasy player last season and drafted in the early first round of most fantasy drafts this year, is Soto. But right now, while he's injured, even though it might only be 10 days, this is the lowest his value will be until he comes back, is Soto. And actually, he was struggling a little in the last 4 games before he went on the injured list. April 16th versus Arizona, 0 for 3 in that game with a 250 bat on base. April 17th versus Arizona, 0 for 4 with an RBI. April 18th versus Arizona, 0 for 2. And then versus St. Louis, April 19th, 1 for 4 with a run scored. So right now, Soto, he wasn't producing big numbers like you expected so far in the early going. And now with him on the injured list, his value's at an all-time low, and I would go out there and get him. The next hitter to get this week is George Springer of the Toronto Blue Jays. So Springer, he's been banged up the whole season so far, and this is the time to go out there and get Springer before he comes back next week from the injury of Springer. So he had the oblique injury, and obviously those oblique injuries, they're very tricky, especially for hitters where they got to use their whole body and torque into the baseball. So Springer, he signed a big 6-year, $150 million contract in the offseason with the Toronto Blue Jays. And obviously there's frustration from fantasy owners in the Blue Jays who had high hopes for Springer. And he'll be out the first month of the season by the time he comes back next week. So last season, Springer had a monster year and got the monster contract. He had 14 home runs, 32 RBIs, a 265 batting average, a 359 on base, and 37 runs and a stolen base in the 60-game season. So Springer, hopefully he comes back 100% healthy and he could drive the baseball and put up big numbers. But right now, if there's a guy in your league who's trying to trade George Springer and he's on the block for cheap, this is the time to do it before he comes back and puts up big numbers for this season. The next hitter is Starling Marte of the Miami Marlins, another hitter on the list here who's injured. And Marte, he went on the injured list a couple days ago with a rib injury. And so far in the early going, it was a good season for Marte. 18 for 58 from the plate, 2 home runs, 3 stolen bases, a 310 batting average, a 414 on base, and 15 runs scored, where he was up there in the leaderboard in runs scored in the early going. So Marte, he's a hustler. He's a guy that does a little bit of everything for his teams and obviously for fantasy teams as well. And he was a player taken in the 4th or 5th round for a reason. And the last few games before he went down was Marte. April 15th at Atlanta, 1 for 3 with a homer. April 16th at Atlanta, 1 for 4 with a homer and 3 RBIs. April 17th versus San Francisco, 1 for 4 with 2 runs, an RBI, and a stolen base. And April 18th versus San Francisco, he went 1 for 3 in that game. So Marte, he was hitting the ball great. He showed some pop as well, and he was getting a lot of runs scored and stolen bases. So right now, while he's on the injured list, this is the perfect time, in my opinion, to go out there and get him before he comes back and he starts raking again, and his value will be at an all-time high. In the fifth and final hitter, I will look to get in a trade this week and buy lows Anthony Rizzo of the Chicago Cubs. So Rizzo, it's a contract season for him after this year, and so far the Cubs, they're off to a mediocre start, and they got a lot of pending free agents. And Rizzo, obviously, Javier Baez and Chris Bryant. So far in the season for Rizzo, 14 of 57 from the plate, 3 home runs, 5 RBIs, 10 runs scored, 2 stolen bases, a 246 batting average, but a good on-base percentage still at 371. So right now the power, it's pretty mediocre for Rizzo. But in one game, Rizzo got most of his home runs with a 2-home-run game, April 18th versus the Atlanta Braves. But right now the average is low. The on-base is still at a good percentage here for Rizzo. But I think Rizzo's going to have a huge season, especially like I mentioned, with the contract season coming up here. So Anthony Rizzo, he's a guy I would go out there and trade for, and I don't think you have to give up much for him with his RBIs low right now and the batting average in the 250s, even though the last few seasons his average only finished in that range. The last few games for Rizzo, April 17th versus Atlanta, 3 for 4 with 2 runs. April 18th versus Atlanta, 2 for 4 with 2 homers, like I mentioned in that one. April 20th versus the Mets, 0 for 3, and last night versus the Mets, 1 for 2 with 3 runs scored and an RBI. So Rizzo, he hasn't totally been a disaster in fantasy baseball, but he hasn't put up the numbers you expect, and I expect more out of him, and I think you could get him on a discount this week. So that's a few hitters I will look to buy low here in week 3 of the fantasy baseball season.